Jesus did a lot of different miracles. Some of them were helping and healing people. Others showed something about him, revealed about who Jesus was and what God was doing. They proved his authority and his purpose in being with people. One of those miracles starts actually with Jesus asleep. He and the disciples had gotten on a boat and were going across the Sea of Tiberias, or Lake Gennesaret. And as they were going, a storm came up. The wind was howling. The rain was whipping across and hitting them in the face. And the boat was tossing and turning. And Jesus was still asleep. And the disciples shook him and said, "Jesus, wake up. Do you care that we are perishing?" Now you and I know Jesus cared about people and their lives. But Jesus, he stood up and he said, "Peace, be still." Now, I don't know if Jesus was talking to the wind and to the waves, or if he was talking to the disciples, but both of them listened to Jesus. Even creation listened to Jesus. There's another time when the disciples were out on the sea, but this time Jesus wasn't actually in the boat. He had stayed behind. His cousin John the Baptist had just been beheaded by Herod, and Jesus just needed some time to himself and some time to pray, and he told the disciples that he would catch up with them. And none of them were foolish enough to ask how he planned to do that. But he did. And he did it in the most unexpected of ways by walking on the water itself. Now, when Jesus was first far off, they were afraid because they didn't know who he was or what was going on. And as he got closer and they realized that it was Jesus, their jaws were dropped open and they were amazed. Peter was excited. He thought this was amazing. And so he said, "Jesus, bid me to come out on the water to you." And so Jesus said, Come out on the water." And would you believe, Peter stepped out and stood on that water, and he started walking on top of that water. He also started thinking. And when Peter started thinking, that's actually when he started sinking. Because he remembered that walking on water is impossible. And all of a sudden he shouted out to Jesus, "Lord, help me." And before he could even get the words out of his mouth, Jesus reached out and took his arm and pulled him up and got him back in the boat to safety. Soon after this, there was another time when Jesus was teaching a very large crowd. And he'd been preaching and teaching all day long, and he'd been healing people and helping people. And it was getting late, and the disciples said, "Jesus, we've got to send these people home. They need something to eat." And Jesus said, "Well, feed them something." They looked at each other like Jesus was crazy. That would be impossible. There were 5,000 men gathered there, plus some women and children. Even if they sent them to a local town, it would have been overwhelming. There wouldn't have been enough food for all of them to eat. And so Jesus says to them, "Well, what do you have?" The disciples looked around and said, and a voice came forward, and he had a couple loaves of bread and some fish. And Jesus took what this young boy offered, and Jesus held them up and prayed. He gave thanks to God for God's abundance, for all that God gives. And then he gave that bread and those fish to the disciples, and he said, "Okay, hand them out." Would you believe that as they handed that stuff out, they didn't run out? There was plenty for everybody. Now, I don't know exactly what the miracle was, if Jesus multiplied that bread and those fish into more bread and more fish and more bread and more fish and more, or if Jesus just opened up the hearts of all the people that were there, and each of them opened up their bags and shared what they had, like that little boy. I don't know what the real miracle was, but the truth is that everyone had plenty to eat. There's so much among these people, so much that God had provided that they even had leftovers. And everyone was filled. This is the way God acts. Through many of these miracles, the people were beginning to learn that Jesus had the power of God. Maybe Jesus was actually God in the flesh. And they were excited about this, and they were terrified that God was with them, all at the same time, as they probably should have been.